Welcome to the Responsible Bytes podcast, everyone, the podcast where we talk about all things safe and responsible technology. I'm your host, Dr. Zena Assaad, and today we are joined by Dr. Lena Trabucco, who is a non-residential research fellow at the Stockton Center for International Law at the U.S. Naval War College. Welcome to the podcast, Lena.
Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you on this podcast. Now, I know you do a lot of work around AI and autonomous systems in the military domain. Can you talk a little bit about why these systems are different to other weapon systems and why they've been getting so much attention over the last few years?
Yeah, sure. So I think that this question is coming up more and more. Like, what is really new here? What are we talking about? What's really unique? What's really novel? And and especially, I'll just, as a quick anecdote, was at a workshop with a bunch of international lawyers, and they really just kept coming back to this question: what is different or new for the law about this kind of weapon system? Was what we were talking about in that particular context. And I think that this is a good question. So I tend to approach this by thinking about what's not new. And I think what's not new is that the way we talk about this as being this revolutionary technology, is it going to change the character of war? Is it going to, that there's, calls for or need for a larger, governance regime around this kind of capability? What does it mean to do it responsibly? I think those questions have arisen with plenty of new technologies, plenty of new kinds of weapons, right? That's not new when it comes to AI. To me, what's new with this kind of like a qualitatively new capability that's happening here, or a qualitatively new, domain of it, is that we're rethinking the role of humans in warfare. And I think that this question of human control, admittedly, I'm a bit biased because this is what I research all the time. But I think this question of human control is really what's new. And it's forcing us, I think, to have a very open and candid conversation about what role do humans have, what role should humans have, and what is the future going to look like in terms of our own judgment, our own control. The terms that are used are always sort of changing, but I think it no matter what term we use, it kind of boils down to the same relationship that we're trying to examine. And so I think this is what's new with this weapon system, is what I mostly focus on in my work. So I think this is the unprecedented piece of it all.
What do you mean when you say human control?
Yeah, this is a good question. And
this is the Pandora's box.
Exactly. It's a surprisingly difficult question, as I learned over the last
It is a very difficult question because of what you said, this idea of terminology and language, and we're looking at a very interdisciplinary field. So I want to understand, what do you mean when you talk about human control?
When I talk about human control, what I'm actually referring to in a project that I've just completed is really, I think, more accurately called a network of human control. I think that human control doesn't belong or is not isolated to one human or one person. I think that there is a long timeline of humans that are involved from many different stages throughout a weapon system's life cycle, and they all contribute something different from their own respective roles and functions within that timeline. And together, they kind of form this network that sets certain boundaries in place, which I think is a sense of control. Now, in terms of the actual people that we're talking about along that line, because that could be volumes of books written about all of the different people that are involved in that timeline, right? With lots of people. But I focused on three in particular, three groups of people, really, in this project, or at least this sort of beginning, part of the project. I think that there's a book somewhere in my future on this, but for now, it's just a 3-part series. So the first part looks at software designers and developers and tries to grapple with what role do they have, and in terms of making decisions for the system, what kind of interaction do they have with designing and developing or engineering these systems that are unique to their particular role. Um, the second paper looks at commanders. What specific role do commanders have within that timeline that is unique to them? And how do they contribute or reflect a sense of human judgment within their own function and role? And the third and final is the operator, where I think early stages of these human control discussions were really focused on that person, right? That operator. I think that's traditionally and historically where human control, for those listening, I'm using air quotes, human control has existed, right? As sort of that whoever is
It's
controlling
the
the.
most obvious one, isn't it?
It is the most obvious one. And you can think about it in control in the sense of like turning it left or right? You're going to turn
Mm.
it this way or that way. And I don't think that that's what control really looks like in this particular example, in this particular case. So I think that what I argue in my work and what I've sort of come to as a conclusion is that I think that these people in this timeline, the many of them, um, embed human judgment from their own respective roles, but together they contribute to this larger network of human control. So I try to avoid using control at sort of an individual level, and I think it's more of a collective effort.
So, for our listeners, I will put links to those 3 papers in the show notes. But I want to understand, so I asked you specifically, how do you define human control? Because it's been defined quite differently, across this field. And there
Mhm.
are even people who are calling to not talk about human control anymore, just this idea of control, right? And that word has been replaced by other words. So why do you think this idea of human control and the language around it has been such a divisive topic?
I think it's because a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different backgrounds are coming at this question with different like baggage, right? We're coming at this question with different understandings and different, like immediate impressions of what we mean when we say human control. And I think that there's and I think that it's extremely important for those conversations to happen right across disciplines, because otherwise you're never going to overcome this hurdle of just sort of squabbling about definitions and, is it interaction? Is it meaningful human control? Is it,
You and I
what is
have both been in plenty of forums where we've squabbled about these definitions.
plenty? And, there is something to the squabbling. I mean, there is like there can
There is
be.
some reason to it.
There is, and there can be something productive about that too, right? But I think that unless we understand the sort of larger background that's coming from these different disciplines, then we're not really going to make any kind of meaningful progress in
Pun intended.
it was absolutely intended. We're not going to make like progress in coming up with some kind of I think useful understanding. So in my work, I really tried to talk to as many people as I could along that timeline, like from military perspective, lots of legal advisors, weapons officers, fighter pilots, like lots of different roles, very high ranking commanders, to try to understand what did human control look like from their perspective, and what from their own perspective did they think it should be, right? What should it look like from their own experience, and then policy, of course. But I think policy stakeholders have very different impressions on what human control is going to be. I think the policy space is still where we see meaningful human control as often the term that's still used, despite its many flaws, which have been squabbled about for many years at this point. Um, and then I think what's interesting is the technical community has a really different language that they use to talk about this relationship as well. So it was always, in fact, the sort of origin story of this project really came from my some discussions I had with a software engineer, and he had such a different understanding of like what human control meant than I did, and I was really struck by that, and that he was going forward in his work with this kind of definition of it that I thought was so limited and not thinking sort of broadly at all, and didn't have a lot of, background with thinking about weapon systems or things like this. So it was really interesting to me to realize that all of these different backgrounds are coming together to try to inform this very real challenge, and I think a challenge that is a core piece of how we're going to incorporate weapon systems and how we're going to govern around them and how we're going to regulate them, uh, and do it responsibly. So I think that overcoming that divisiveness is a key piece to move forward, but that's not going to happen without really like tough conversations across the different disciplines.
On the topic of tough conversations, you
Mhm.
talk about this idea of a network of human control across the life cycle of these systems.
Mhm.
I would argue there is a network of human control across the life cycle of traditional weapon systems that are not
Mhm.
AI or autonomously enabled. So,
Mhm.
why are we having these discussions about AI and autonomy and not about these more traditional weapon systems? Or have we been having discussions about them, but just in different ways? What is that key difference that we seem to think this is such a critical and important topic for AI and autonomous weapon systems, but not for traditional, I don't know if traditional is the right word, maybe legacy weapon systems is a better word here, but what is that difference there?
So I think two things, because I think you're absolutely right. Um, there's so many pieces of that timeline that are still exactly the same, even in the sort of wildest AI system we can imagine, right? Where human control is non-existent, as some people would argue. But I think what's different is two things. So I think one is that it depends on what we mean when we're saying an AI in a weapon system, right? That could mean a range of different capabilities. We could be talking about a number of different types of systems. So and I think this is also where a lot of miscommunication happens. I mean, you know this probably even better than I do, right? Where especially non-technical people are really conflating terms.
Hmm.
Autonomous weapon system, AI-enabled autonomous weapon system, right? A lot of these are used interchangeably when they actually mean something different, and so I think that what's different in this conversation is that we're not always talking about the same thing. And I think that we're not always imagining the same thing. Even if we say AI enabled autonomous weapon system, what I have in my mind might be different from what you have in your mind, might be different from another person has in their mind. And so it's difficult um, to, I think, navigate with a bunch of people with sort of this like hypothetical, system, weapon system that we're all really concerned about. Um, and so I think it's just like a ripe space for misunderstanding. And I think it happens all the time when we're having these conversations. I think the other thing that's different is that operator like role that we were talking about. I do think that there's a difference here for operators as compared to like non-AI systems or conventional weapon
Mm.
systems. I think their role is different, and in the paper where I really grapple with the operator, I really had to walk away from it, the paper writing, for like a week to really think about what is different about the operator specifically, their role with this type of system as compared to a non-AI system, and compared to commanders, developers, right, other people, other roles along the timeline. What is unique about this operator function? And ultimately, I came down to three things that I think is unique here for the operator specifically, that commanders don't do and designers and developers don't do. I think that operators guide, observe, and terminate. Right. These are their three functions that are unique to the operator specifically, and I kind of go into detail with each one of those, and the papers will be released very soon. Um, but I think that there is with an AI-enabled autonomous weapon system as a sort of heading that we can use to maybe put under a number of different systems. But I do think that the role for operators is different here. And I think that their function is changing, and no better audience for sort of testing that uh, new role as fighter pilots, right? So who I think are often considered the ones who might be, most likely to be out of a job with this kind of capability, right? So I spoke to a lot of them in writing that third paper, and those conversations were just invaluable, and it was really fascinating to hear what they had to say. I think you've mentioned too that you've had some conversations with fighter pilots specifically, right?
Yeah, and the interesting thing for me is, and I'm talking about this from an Australian perspective, but
Hmm.
being a fighter pilot was a huge part of their identity.
Yeah.
And so when we talked about drones, they weren't very receptive to drones because a drone, not only from their perspective, took their job away from them, it took their identity away
Mm.
from them. And so this idea of the acceptance of this technology was really hard for them because it wasn't just like, oh, my job is going to be replaced. It was like, this is my identity, because to become a fighter pilot is not an easy thing. It's a small statistic of people who end up in that kind of role. It requires a lot of training. You have to meet certain physical requirements. You have to meet certain psychological requirements. So it was very much ingrained in their identity. And so for them, when I spoke to them about this particular thing, their responses I felt were very personal. And that was the most interesting part for me. And they were all basically adamant that drones could not completely replace them,
Yeah.
which, to be fair, I actually do agree. And I always talk about this. I say that technology will not replace your job. It will augment your job. And I do believe that. So I don't believe that drones will completely replace fighter pilots. What I believe is that it will augment what the role of a fighter pilot would be.
I completely agree. Yeah, and it was really interesting to have these conversations because I got a really different. I definitely got the identity piece, right? That was for sure there. But I think that nearly every single one of the pilots that I spoke to had a really interesting comment, which was about how their like very technical skills that they are trained to, for many, many years. I mean, the what these, people are going through is really intense training. But they had mentioned that they hadn't used their technical skills really because they hadn't needed to. They haven't been in a situation where fighter pilots are really like necessary to carry out some kind of a really highly technical and challenging mission necessarily. And I was really struck by this because I think I got the sense that there was a like we we're concerned that we're not as maybe well up to speed, I guess, right, in terms of using our skills. And there was, and then of course the other piece that kept coming up constantly was trust, and establishing and building trust in with an AI system. It it didn't seem to me something that they thought was like insurmountable, but it was an endeavor, right? A journey that they were going to have to go on in establishing that trust. But I didn't get the sense that they thought that it was going to be impossible to do.
It's interesting to see the difference in perspectives. And I love the fact that when you were writing this, you had to step away and speak to other people because we can get quite insular in our thinking when we're working on these kinds of things. And sometimes it does create a little bit of tunnel vision. So, are there any other things that you like to do to diversify your thinking when you're working on specific projects?
Yeah, I'll just echo again. I think the biggest thing is really getting out of my bubble, like and talking with lots of different people. Even when I think the person I'm speaking with, they're like, "Why is she reaching out to me?
Why are
Why?"
you speaking to me?
Exactly. Why are we having this conversation? I definitely got that sense a couple of times, but I find it really, really helpful to try to kind of climb into somebody else's seat and see these questions from a really, really different perspective. And I always walk away with something new. I even was able to wiggle my way into an invitation to the Pentagon this way to go to go for a meeting because I think the guy was like, "Why are we talking about this?"
And you were like, "It's
But
fine. It's great.
it's
I'd love
fine.
to.
He's
I'd love
gonna
to be invited. Thank you so much."
exactly. Yes, it was kind of like that. But it worked out, and it was we actually had a really great conversation, and he was a really just lovely guy. So it's, I think that it took a lot of I think it took a lot of groundwork and effort to really just start reaching out to people, and and expect really that no one was going to respond, but actually quite a lot of people did, and quite a lot of people were really open to speaking with an academic about some of these questions. And I really just phrased it as like, let's just have a cup of coffee and talk about really big things, and people were pretty excited about that.
Did you
When
find that
I
it helped to frame your argument though? So, I'm in the midst of writing a paper at the moment, and internally I feel as though I know what the argument is that I want to make. But when I go to write it down, I have this intellectual block basically, and I cannot get the argument out. And my husband's a software engineer, and I was complaining to him. I was like, I know what I want to say. I just can't seem to say it. And he was like, "Oh, do you want to talk through the argument together?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much." So I start talking to him and trying to articulate this argument, and he's asking me all these questions and I can't answer them. It made me so frustrated because I knew that I had this argument there and I knew what the dots were. I just couldn't piece those dots together. So I don't know if you've ever had that experience, and then talking with other people sometimes helps to bridge those gaps. But I remember having this conversation with him and I started to get frustrated, not at him, at myself, because I was like, I swear this argument is strong. I swear it's sound, but I just could not articulate it.
It sounds like you're just on the cusp of getting it, but it's because I think that this happens all the time. And I was in a really lucky position with this particular project where I had 2 years to do this project. So I had lots of time to be able to step away and really just think, not try to write, not try to read, not consume anymore, but really just walk away, kind of stare at a wall and think and try to figure out, what am I saying? What am I finding from all of these conversations and from all this work I've been doing? But what am I trying to say? And then I force myself to try to write it in one sentence, only one sentence. And that's
Which
the
is so hard to do.
is extremely hard to do. It's maybe the hardest part of the whole process. But once I'm able to boil it down to that one sentence, I'll even write it down and kind of tape it to my laptop as I'm writing the paper so that I don't veer too far off course. I have to kind of come back to this sentence, right? That's guiding the whole thing. And I think that that's helpful. But of course, there are always times where the creativity just fizzles out, and which I think is natural, especially in a long-term project. Um, and so I'll often turn to fiction, and fiction books, and or fiction writing, even if I'm feeling really writer's block with my academic work. I have a really silly story that I write on the side, and I'll just go and write 500 words there, and it just gets juices flowing. And I'll try to pivot back over to my academic work. It usually works.
Are you
But
comfortable sharing? You don't have to share the full details of the story, but maybe at least the genre so we can get a flavor of, because we're going from, writing about AI and autonomous weapon systems and
yeah,
human control to writing about.
murder mysteries. And you would think I would say science fiction, right? You would think I would say, and I love science fiction, of course. But since I was a child, I have been such a fan of like detective stories and mysteries, and Agatha Christie was like my first, I was such a fangirl. And what I love about it is that it's a puzzle. Like I know when I read the book, the clues are there. The author has to leave the clues for you to pick up and put the pieces together, but they're presenting it in a way to intentionally mislead you away from who the true, culprit is going to be. And so it's a game of trying to pick up the signals, the pieces, the clues to solve the puzzle and read beyond what the author is just trying to present to you. There's a strategy there, and I find myself reading the stories very strategically now to try to solve the puzzle, and I can do the same thing with my academic work when I'm really struggling. Right, I'll really try to think about this as a puzzle, and I have these clues and these pieces, and I have to try to put this puzzle together. And I did have to do that a few times with this human control stuff because it could be as big or as narrow as you want it to be. And I really tried to approach the question in a way that was going to be like understandable, simplified, but really digestible and understandable, but also relevant to a lot of different disciplines. So even though it's published in a law journal, I think that there are clues, nuggets, pieces that are really, I think, interesting or new for a lot of different, people with technical backgrounds, hopefully lawyers as well, policy, ethics. I think that there's a lot to that I tried to piece in that I think will find relevance there. But I had to resort to some of these, fiction writing methods to bring that in, I think.
I'm also a big reader. So in my spare time, I don't read anything related to my work.
Hmm.
It's a kind of a hard boundary that I have because academia really has no boundaries at all. It's a
Absolutely.
very all-consuming career. And so in my spare time, I don't read anything relate. Like I will not even read a book. Like I don't read sci-fi. I'm just not. This is a very strong boundary for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But one of the things that I struggle with my writing, even when I turn to fiction to read something else and to, kind of switch my brain onto a different frequency, writing is so tied to how you feel.
Yeah.
I've spoken to a lot of my colleagues about this. So writing is so tied to how you feel. There are some days where I will be feeling really good about my work, feeling good about, the particular project I'm working on, and I will write something up like, well, I'm really proud of what I just wrote. That's great. And then there are other days where, like what I was talking about before, where I had this argument and I couldn't articulate it. And I was trying to do that thing where you just force yourself to write and you don't worry about whether or not the sentence is, correct or incorrect or good or bad. You just write and you get the content out.
Hmm.
And I was having one of those days and I went back and read this paragraph that I wrote and I was like, this is horrendous. Like, this is so bad.
It
And it
happens
was just
all the
so
time.
tied emotionally. So it's not, writing is a practice. It is. And you do have to write every day if you write for your job, which we do. But I don't
Mhm.
think people realize how tied it is to your emotional state for each day.
Absolutely. And how quickly that can change, right? And
Yeah.
it depends on so many factors. And sometimes it's like painful. I find especially grant writing to be like
Oh.
physically painful to write,
I'm like, what do you want from me? Just give me your money, please.
Exactly. Like I just trust that I know how to do this research.
Also, the
No,
success rate of grant, right? I don't know what the actual statistics are, but you're successful less often than you are unsuccessful. So, you get
exactly.
rejected quite a lot. And I think that's the emotional part of grant writing. You're writing this grant knowing there's a 4 out of 5 chance that you're not going to get it.
Right. And you have to sort of trust that like this is going to improve, right? There is something that you're paying into this process by doing this, that even if it's not going to be the research money, that it's the skill and the practice that you're going to improve and get better, which hopefully results in more research funding later. But it's really difficult, and and I think that it's the writing aspect is just I think it's the hardest part of the job. Um,
It's the
yeah.
hardest and the best in both ways. It's one of those at least for me, it's a love hate relationship. I
Yeah.
love writing. I love some of the work that you can't love everything that you do, you know, because there are different circumstances in which you've done work where there were really hard deadlines and you just had to get it out. And then there's also the ones where, you know, you've slaved over a paper and it comes back with those blind peer reviews and it's just such a dreadful experience to have to try to action them. And
Yeah.
especially, so I don't believe in blind peer reviews. I think that your name should always be against any piece of feedback that you give. I think that the feedback would be far more constructive if we had to forego this idea of blind peer reviews.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting part for me is one of the hardest things about this work, and you touched on this, is putting boundaries around what we're going to write about. So you spoke about how, you know, you write it in one sentence, you put it on your laptop, and then you refer back to it so that if you veer away, you're like, no, and you bring yourself back. Because it's really hard to try and contain what you're trying to talk about. And you can't talk about everything in one paper because then it just becomes this kind of mismatch of all of these different ideas that don't really come together. So you've got to be quite, you know, siloed and contained in what you're talking about. And then you always get that one blind peer review that's like, well, have you considered this? And it's like, yes, I did. But it is so out of scope and I can't talk about it in under 5,000 words.
Exactly. It's impossible. And at some point, right, it's just you have to make very hard decisions. And I think with the job, right, is a big part of it is writing. Like you said, you have to do, you know, some of it every day. But I think and it is a love-hate relationship with writing. I also love how flexible it is. You can do it from anywhere. If I need to get up and change scenery, I can go to my favorite coffee shop and try again, right? But I think even more than writing is you have to love editing. I think you have to, like, going back to what you've done, as you said, like to review and realize, like, okay, I was way off in this paragraph that I wrote.
You're editing different versions of yourself.
You are. Absolutely, you are. Yeah. I can very much tell which paragraphs were written after a night where my baby didn't sleep. Right. and I say, yes, okay, that must have been Thursday because I was in a daze the entire day and this paragraph makes no sense. So it's a you know, it's a constant effort.
So you've mentioned your baby, and I know that you have just come back from maternity leave. So where did you kind of leave off before you left on your maternity leave, and where have you picked up from now?
Yeah, I left off in a really good place with research. I really I felt really bad for anyone who visited me last summer because I was in such a focus to finish the drafts of these for this human control project, and I did a week before she was born. I finished.
Wow.
I finished the drafts and sent them to the journal, and luckily the journal. Maybe it wouldn't have been so lucky for anyone else, but it was for me. The journal was at a moment where it had a lot on its backlog. So they were like, it might be a while. I said, it's fine. Take your time. I have to go.
I have to take care of a little human.
I have to go take care of a new human. I will not be in the space to do edits for a few months anyway. So, you know, that's fine. So it worked out really well, time-wise and in terms of the workload. But coming back, has been a challenge. It's really difficult, I think, to have to really dust off the cobwebs on your brain after being in real baby mode for, you know, she's 10 months now. So so I guess for like 8 months or so I was really on maternity leave. And as you know, because I have told you many times, we had multiple transatlantic moves during that time. And we've been in 3 countries for over the last 3 years and with a toddler and a baby. And it has just been complete madness. I don't recommend doing it, although it's been a blast having all these adventures as a little family, but it also has its fair share of stress.
I had a colleague who told me that moving house was a divorce-inducing activity, and I don't think I've ever heard it be described so accurately.
Yes, absolutely. I think that my husband and I really feel like we are so solid after going through
You're
all
like,
of
if we can get through 3 international moves, we can get through anything.
Exactly. I think we feel very good about that. But so it's been, you know, a lot of extra noise going on, even beyond just the baby and my toddler as well. So trying to shift back into work mode has been really difficult, and it's one that I know a lot of my friends that have had children, echo the same sort of sentiment. There's just so many competing demands on your time where you have to completely shift what how you interact with the problem. Like a lot of the strategies that I had learned to be a successful academic do not make me a successful mother, right? So it is a complete shift of my, personality and of my whole sort of self in order to really be there for my kids and be, grounded when my toddler is having a meltdown over what I made for dinner, and then or not rushing bedtime because I know I have to do a couple more hours of work or something, and trying to be really present with them, but then have to shift as soon as I can do that into work mode, which I always used to find difficult before I had kids. Like I would
Yeah.
get to the computer and maybe look at a couple websites. I'd look at my emails and
I'm
scroll a bit
exactly the
here.
same. It takes me time to really sink into work mode,
Exactly.
especially the kind of thinking that is required when we're writing. So this is what I was talking about before of like, I know I've got the argument in me. It just takes a while
Mhm.
to come out, and you've kind of got to get your brain back into that train of thought, and it takes time.
It takes time. It does take time. But I think that having very small children has also made me way more efficient with my time than I was before I had kids. And it's because oftentimes I'll only have 3 hours to work in a day. So I have, to really make the most out of those 3 hours. But but this is sort of the way it goes. I remember I can't remember who it was now, but I saw I was pregnant with my first at the time, and they had written a tweet, like it was on Twitter about or X. It
I
was Twitter at
refuse
the
to
time.
call it X. It's
I
so
know it,
stupid.
and it was Twitter at the time, so it was on Twitter, um, and they were talking about how children made them so much more efficient with their time, and I was like, I don't know how I'm possibly going to do that. Like time management was something I always like had plenty of time, and so I totally understand it now that I have to squeeze so much work into such a small amount of time, and then be ready to turn it off again, and be there for like as I was saying to you, right, that today I was hoping to think about all of these things for our discussion today, but my baby got sick and she was home and she crawled for the first time.
Oh, that's
So
so
it
exciting.
I was
But
really
it's a
glad.
lot mentally, right? It's like my baby crawled for the first time. This is so exciting, but I also have this work thing I have to do.
But that's what you get used to, right? That's like the skill that I think I'm really working on now and developing is this sort of dual things that are always operating at the same time in my brain and in my life. And it's it takes time. I think it takes time to learn how to navigate through that.
Has it changed the kind of direction you want your career to go in?
Yes. Yeah, I think it has because I think that well, I should say that it has to a degree. I think that it has, um, having children anyway has made me more, more grounded. And I think it's made me want to, I guess, put roots down in a way that maybe didn't always appeal to me before having kids, where I was a bit of a wanting to travel all the time, and I should say, I mean, clearly I'm doing that anyway and satisfying that sort of side of
Living in
myself
3 different countries is, what did you say, 3 years?
in 3 years. Yeah,
Every
yeah,
year, it's like a new country.
exactly. It is. We've gotten very effective at how to move to a new country. But it's but I also think that the general like ambitions that I had in my career are still the same, and maybe even more important to me now than they were before, because I really wanted my kids to see their mom pursuing her goals and wanting to not lose that part of herself, and show that I can also have a life that's outside of my family. And I know that that's not what all, parents want. I think that a lot of women and men choose to have their families as the focus and the core, and I completely understand and respect that. But for me, this was an aspect of myself and a huge part of my identity before I was ever a mother. And it was really important to me, and it was important that I not let it go. So it's I think that there was sort of a dual process of sort of getting rooted and grounded um, in our lives and for our family, while still wanting to be able to and making it even more important to go and follow the goals that I had for myself in my career.
That's something that definitely resonates with me as well. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think that they can exist at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely, they can. I think it's really difficult. And I think the way that each person will do that might look different.
Mm.
And I think part of that process, and I have a number of friends who are academics that had children and talked about how their identity was really challenged, and they kind of were lost in who they
Mm.
were. And I think that you have to sort of come to this place where then you know who you are more than ever, and for me that meant really holding on to this, this part of myself that is my work, because I really love my work.
I do too. And I agree with you that it is very much an identity thing. You know, being an academic, your identity is really tied to your work because your work is not a separation of who you are, right? It's your
Mhm.
ideas, it's your thoughts, it's your perspectives, and you put them out there to be judged by the world. And
Absolutely.
it's a really difficult thing, but it's really tied to who we are. That's why academia has very much these like personas and this individuality, because that's what sets you apart, and that's kind of how you
Mhm.
carve a path for yourself. And so it
Mhm.
is a very identity driven career.
It is. It absolutely is. I don't know a single academic that doesn't have that like realization and recognition about themselves and how they see themselves. But I also think that there's a real danger there of really spiraling into it too far, and you're not able to separate, your work from your life anymore. So that's why I think what you said about like having boundaries with what you read is a really good way to do that. Like I similarly, when I'm going to bed and I read before I go to bed, I will not let it be work. It cannot be work reading. No matter how much is on my to-do list, I will not read an article as I'm going to sleep. It will always be a fiction book. And it's and I think that even just, having those little boundaries can make a big difference.
They can. And, you know, it wasn't until I met my husband that those boundaries started to come in because he was like, do you not have any separation between your job and your life? Because so my husband's a software engineer and he works to live. He doesn't live to work.
Mhm.
He's always been that way. You know, he does his job, he gets paid, and then he's got a huge life outside of his job.
Mhm.
Um, and I have a huge life outside of my job, but there's definitely like with my husband, he's got clear boundaries, right? Like work is 9 to 5, I do my job, and then outside of that, I do my own thing. I don't have those kinds of boundaries. So there's a lot of bleeding for me between my personal life and my job. And so, yeah, it wasn't until I met my husband and we started dating and he was like, he's like, is there like no end to your workday? He's like, what is this?
You should work on that.
He was like, this is weird. And I was like, is it?
But I also think it's a real cultural thing. Like my husband is Danish, and his work-life balance is amazing. He's a pediatrician, which often also can be really like a core identity kind of job and
Yeah.
profession. But I think he is so good at separating his life from his work, and I think that I see that also just in a lot of Danish society. It's a lot better than in the States. I'm from the US, so where we are very bad at at this work-life balance thing. And so I've learned a lot by living in Denmark for those years and sort of having him as a partner. I think he's really, really helped with those boundaries.
I loved visiting Denmark, and yes, they do have very strong boundaries between their work life and their personal life, and they're really big on their quality of life, which is
Mhm.
amazing. But for me, the standout part of Denmark was the licorice. I'm a huge licorice person. I will not hear a bad word about it. I don't know why people are like, licorice. I'm just like, oh, it's amazing. And going to a supermarket in an international, when I travel internationally, is my favorite thing. And
Mhm.
the Danish supermarkets, hands down, best international supermarkets I've ever been to in my life. There's like a
Oh, great.
whole section of just licorice and different kinds of licorice, and yeah, amazing.
Okay.
So yes,
If that
quality of life and work-life balance, all that's great, but the licorice, this is,
the
I really
licorice,
feel like, the
if
point.
that is what you're looking for, then yes, Danish supermarkets are definitely the best. And I will say I am getting better at the licorice thing. It was not my favorite, I will
Oh,
say, but
Lena,
it's getting better. It's
but you married a Danish man.
I know, and you know what? Like 10 years from now, I'm gonna be like licorice crazy probably, but
I'll
because
eat
he
them
can
like
say
they're M&Ms. I love licorice. I will literally like a bag of licorice in the cinema or something. I think it's amazing.
that's great. Well, that is your place to be then.
Yeah, I think it is. All right, Lena, we're coming towards the end of today's episode. So I'm going to ask you the final question, which is the question that I ask all my guests. And it is, what is one piece of advice you would give to people to engage with technology safely and responsibly? So what is your one responsible bite?
My one responsible bite, I would say, is talk to everyone. Even if you think, what are we possibly going to talk about or relate about? I think that it is so vital to have these like cross disciplinary discussions, and not only in a way that's like, this is what we say in my discipline. Oh, this is what we say in mine. Okay, but really grapple and engage with each other to understand better, and try to understand the nuance of the debates in different disciplines to the best that you can. And that sometimes happens the best not in a formal workshop or conference, but sometimes having a cup of coffee over Zoom or at a cafe and just hammering it out together. So I think the willingness to talk to others outside of your field, and the willingness to go and engage with people far from your office.
And you never know, you might end up getting an invitation to the Pentagon.
Exactly. You never know.
It's a great place to end this episode on. Lena, you've been amazing to talk to. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.